Folks may remember that some time ago, about a year ago, I did a talk on the Internet of Things, which, among other things, was mentioning 5G technology. And first of all, I want to go over what 5G is and what it isn't. And then we will have, I will have an update on what is happening with the United States rollout of 5G. There was an article in PC Mag that I was using in my previous talk about the Internet of Things that had some information about what kinds of things, let's keep this down where it wants to be, the Internet of Things and this new wireless technology called 5G. Let's start out by what we already have done, and that is going to be, of course there's one of these to kill. There. What we have had up until now is 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G. What does that mean? The G in this 5G means it's a generation of wireless technology. Most generations of technology have been defined by their transmission speeds. By the way, I don't like the term speed, it's really throughput. But anyways, there also were encoding methods or so-called air interfaces that made each generation incompatible with the next. 1G was analog cellular. 2G technologies such as CDMA, GSM, and TDMA were the first generation of digital cellular technologies. And there was a fork that occurred between CDMA and GSM. CDMA, which was adopted by Sprint among others, had no SIM card, but your phone was tied to the carrier because it was activated online and your number wasn't portable and all of that. And people didn't like being tied in with one carrier and having phones like that. GSM could operate with SIM cards, and this made numbers portable, and you could move from one network to another more easily. 3G technologies such as EVDU, HSPA, and UMTS brought speeds from 200 kilobits per second to a few megabits per second. 4G technologies, which we now know are WiMAX and LTE, were the next incompatible leap forward. None of these were compatible with the previous generation. And they are now scaling up to hundreds of megabits and even almost gigabit per second speeds with LTE Advanced and 5G Evolution, which is not actual 5G. 5G brings three new aspects to the table. There's greater speed to move more data, lower latency to be more responsive, and the ability to connect more devices at the same time. That's more devices per cell as well as more devices per hotspot if you have one of those. So the actual 5G radio system, which is known as 5G-NR, is not compatible with 4G. But 5G devices to start with in the US will need 4G compatibility because they'll lean on it to make initial connections. Right now 5G is download only. So to make any upload or any calls or anything, you still need 4G. So when you use 4G and 5G together, it's called NSA, or not standalone. Later they will become, I know the alphabet agency that also has that letter. Later our 5G networks will become standalone, or SA, not requiring 4G and not being compatible with 4G. But that's still a few years off, and it may be quite a few years for reasons I'll get to.
Now when we use the term 5G in the United States,
Yeah.
is that the same thing as the term 5G in China or elsewhere?
Presently, no. There have been some egregious marketing campaigns by AT&T and T-Mobile that said they had 5G. And what they were referring to was gigabit speed. But it's still 4G LTE or 5G Evolution, which is a 4G technology. AT&T has really confused it by calling it 5G evolution.
Are you telling me that the cell phone industry is not part of the national industry? You know, there used to be an organization for national standards, international standards.
Okay, I'll get to why the international standards is getting really problematic. And it has to do with a company called Huawei from China.
Okay.
We'll get to that. That's going to be the very end because I want to save the political stuff for last.
I can see why.
Yeah. So, but the phrasing is designed to confuse less conformed consumers into thinking that things like 5G evolution is 5G when it isn't. 5G networks use a type of encoding called OFDM. Now that's similar to 4G LTE, but it's not the same. It has lower latency and greater flexibility than LTE, which means it has to operate at higher wavelengths, higher frequencies, shorter wavelengths. 5G networks need to be smarter than previous systems. And I may get to how they manage to do that with what's called edge computing and fog computing. They're juggling many more smaller cells, which I'll demonstrate, that can change size and shape. I'll talk about beamforming.
So either the cell towers that we have now will all be replaced, or at least the stuff on them will be replaced?
No, they don't have to be. I'll show you physically what it looks like when you put this stuff on top of a building, or when you put the 5G stuff on lampposts or streetlights, which will not be possible with current 4G because of the size of the antenna.
Gotcha.
But you need a lot more cell towers, do you?
You do need to space them more frequently, and I'll show how that gets done. It's sort of like a mesh network. And I will also get to some tests of where they have rolled this technology out in Chicago and in Dallas, and the differences they've found in what they're able to do in those two cities. Those are two different physical, geographic, and topological conditions. So that all gets kind of interesting. And there are some things still being worked on. But anyway, millimeter wave signals drop off fast with distance, and in fact, if you get outside the cell radius, you'll drop from good signal to nothing on 5G really fast. It's kind of like with digital television. It's either in or it's out.
What
And
frequencies are they operating?
I will show exactly what that is in some graphs.
What about weather conditions?
I will talk a little bit about how rain and trees and stuff can interfere. The field tests show about trees.
Yeah.
And they show about glass buildings and concrete. So yes, that is a problem with millimeter waves, and there are waves that are a little longer wavelengths, lower frequencies, but they carry less data. And there are other problems with using those in the United States. So cellular providers will have to provide many smaller, lower power base stations. For those of you concerned about cancer and RF and all that, that is less of an issue. Even though shorter wavelengths carry higher energies, at lower powers it's actually less radiation. And however, you're closer to it. So it's lower power base stations that, rather than with the fewer, more powerful macro cells, and I will have a graphic about what a macro cell, a microcell, a picocell, and a femtocell are. But anyway, the macro cells put out 20 to 40 watts to offer multi-gigabit speeds at that millimeter waves promise. Whereas you put out 2 to 10 watts with these smaller, closer spaced base stations. Now we can get into a little bit of...
So it's entirely directional too, so you're only getting a fraction. Unless it's beamed at you, you're going to get a lot less anyway.
That depends on something called beamforming. We'll see how that works. So lower energies and femtocells, which is what they use, or picocells, should be safer from the point of view of health effects, or as safe. The first illustration that we're showing is today's wireless infrastructure. What we have over here is several different kinds of coverages. We have a Metro core network, and the Metro core network is going to be sort of like the cloud is in cloud computing. It's your central processing. It covers processing for the whole metro area. And there are several outbound and inbound nodes, which are noted as MSC. Then the smaller cells are metro cells, which are used in suburban areas and can be used to some extent in rural areas. And there's also something known as an RRH, which is for rural areas, and that gets even broader coverage where you have much lower density of people. However, I think some rural areas will not be able to get coverage because it just won't be economical to bring it out to them. The massive MIMO, LTE Pro and 5G, these are the things you beam to buildings. And you can see there are several different discrete beams here that are made by beamforming. And so you're able to fire an intense signal to a small area. And with a little luck, in some of these frequencies, you can even bounce that signal off a building, so that if you have a building in the way, you can get around it. So far, that has not shown up in field tests. The outdoor small cells are the main thing that happen in cities. That's what they've got in Chicago. It's a little different from what they've got in Dallas. In Dallas, it's a little bit more like this massive MIMO, because it sits on top of a building and comes down at you. Whereas these outdoor small cells come from several different locations closer to ground level. And they also have beamforming. And then there's various other ways of using several antennas, and you could theoretically be moving from one antenna's coverage to another, and you might be able to get it so you're not going to lose the signal when you do that. So what I'm going to do is show the next one, the sizes of these cells. Macro cell is this big area. It can cover the whole metro area, suburban and urban. Within the urban area, you've got your microcell. 4G technologies can do both of those. But when you get down to picocells, which are in building and serve about 30 to 100 customers per antenna, then you're getting into something that 5G does, but 4G doesn't do. And inside a building, if you had a fixed wireless, known as FWA, you would be able to distribute the signal using currently existing Wi-Fi or the AG technology or AH technology, which uses a lot of antennas, it uses multiple paths, but it uses a router, just the way you do now. It's Wi-Fi, the way we have now, but it's able to handle a much broader throughput. And inside of a building, you could also have a femtocell, which would serve 1 to 30 people. And that would serve maybe small buildings, maybe just a few people within a building. Each building might have a common antenna that might do the receiving, and they might use wiring like Ethernet to get it to the individual tenants. And here's another angle of what we've got now.
I'm going back to the previous graphic.
Yes.
When you move from one antenna to another, will it be seamless the way that we have today with the telephony? As we're moving from down, we never know that we're changing towers. We just keep talking or doing whatever we're doing.
In order to work properly for self-driving cars or for streaming video in a car, for example, it has to be that way.
Absolutely, I understand that.
And they're trying to get it that way.
Okay, that was the key word. Okay.
But it has not been demonstrated in the field, not at millimeter wavelengths.
That was my understanding, okay.
And I would assume it depends on how many of these towers you have. As they become more dense, then it'll be easier to do that.
True.
Or there's a lot of traffic and it's really hard to get.
Well,
latency.
yeah, that too.
Think of all the data going between two self-driving cars so they can communicate and not hit.
That has to do with how far out you can push the processing in the network. If you can push more processing to the edge of the network, then you're going to do better on that sort of thing.
Aside from the solution, The issue is latency.
Yes, and latency is much lower with millimeter waves, much lower if you have edge processing going on. And why don't we just move on to what edge processing and cloud computing do? In traditional cloud computing, everything goes into a central data silo, and it has to come back out. That's going to produce latency, Peter. But what they're doing
Does
now...
everybody understand what latency is?
Latency is how long it takes for a signal to go from here to there. It's the time lag. For example, you're trying to download and then play Netflix. How long does it take between the time you push that button and the time you start playing? And how much stuttering and how much loss of signal do you get? How long is it going to buffer?
Yeah, and it has nothing to do, or little to do, with how long it takes for a signal to get from place to place. It's about processing.
Right, it could take no time for the signal, but if it doesn't get sent for a second,
Yeah,
then it'll take you a while to get it.
yeah.
Yeah, the processing is, in fact, the bottleneck, which is why they're pushing the silos out into smaller units, which are called fog computing. The fog comes out farther. But then you have the edge, which is an intelligent edge. And that's where you really get the advantage in terms of latency being reduced.
So does this mean that for the town of Lexington, say,
Yeah.
sooner or later, the Communication Advisory Committee is going to have to decide where it's going to allow RCN and Comcast and others to augment their current towers?
Well, or to put in new devices. Let me blow this one up and show you just what we might have. You might have just a light post or a lamp post. This is the antenna on top, and this is the processing. Or it might look like a mailbox. So it might not be too difficult to get approval from the appearance point of view. But people are going to worry about radiation.
My concern is more that every town has an organization. In Lexington, it happens to be a very good one.
Yes.
Ken Pogren runs. But every town is going to go through the politics of what they're going to have to do to get this thing going.
Correct.
So it's
This-
also Verizon, AT&T that are more involved with that, and they're going to try to compete against, Comcast and RCN and so on. So, because right now they can't get a wire to your house, and they'll have this as a service that they can give you cable over.
Now Comcast already has access to the utility poles, and RCN also does. Verizon uses fiber optic, and they may have a little bit more of a challenge, except Verizon also has cell phone service, so they have access to cell towers, and they will have access to these newer, smaller neighborhood towers. And they aren't really towers as such, but you've got to convince people that they're safe, that they're not going to be too unsightly, that you're not going to have cancer clusters. And yeah, it goes before committee after committee after committee. In Waltham, it's even worse than it is in Lexington. Yeah.
So putting stuff on towers is interesting until you get to the point, as you have today, if there's a problem with a pole
Yeah.
that happens to have a light on it.
A problem with a pole, what?
That happens to have a device on it.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
today we'll just call it a street light
Yeah,
in a residential area.
okay,
The pole decides to stop working and collapse on itself.
right,
2 years later, there's double poles and nothing changed and lots of things holding it up.
yeah.
Those people are without cell service when you have to rely on something like this because the cell service won't be there as well or will be impacted.
Yes, these are problems that will have to be dealt with, just like any other infrastructure problems we have today, like trying to upgrade the T's signaling, the MBTA signaling stuff. That has resulted in serious issues, and there's been a lot of wrangling over how to handle that.
Now, and not related, but a different question along the same line. Has Akamai decided to get into this cloud computing business? The way they buffer the internet?
Which one again?
Akamai?
I haven't read their name with regard to it, but we don't know exactly which companies yet are going to handle the processing part.
You understand their role in the internet, don't you?
What exactly do they do?
Okay, so when you go to something like Google,
Right.
you don't end up going to California or wherever
Oh,
it is.
Akamai,
Yeah.
that company,
That
yes.
Akamai.
Keep going though.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so what the Akamai provides a service, I don't know if they're the only one or they're the biggest player. But what they do is they download and cache, save information from the internet. So that when you have to stream something, or you want to go to Google to search something,
Yeah.
or look at the news or whatever it is, you don't end up bombarding California
No.
from around the world. You end up going to a local server, a local provider, run by Akamai, that has already downloaded this stuff and has it sitting in memory somewhere. And you just get the local copy of whatever it is.
I expect that sort of thing will expand, whereas also what the ISPs do, where they cache your programming content, more of what people will do that will use 5G will involve streaming and similar services than anything else initially. And there will be the Internet of Things. IoT processing might involve a company like Akamai. But programming content will probably involve the ISPs, Comcast, Verizon.
So
people
it's
like that.
hybrids on this stuff, right? Because Akamai is mostly static content that gets pushed out, and Google and people like that have their own private that compete against it. And then people like Netflix that used to use 30% of the space during the afternoon would provide caching boxes to like RCN and so on to make their networks more efficient.
I think Akamai buffers things like Facebook Live and other things like that. They go through a very high-speed network, and they cache.
Yeah, they were private, it's worldwide.
They cache that stuff, and so even though it's live, it's a nanosecond delay because they're caching it first, and you're
But
getting
the
it
problem is
second.
dynamic content that changes, and that isn't as easily cached.
Well, gentlemen, I think we'll see.
Stuff that's longer lived is delivered closer to the.
I suspect that's.
I think we'll see what happens about that sort of thing. You both have very good points.
Let me make a positive statement about the Communication Advisory Committee, because some of you might be interested in pursuing that. This is an organization that's been around in town for, what, George, 20 years? Anyway.
Since we had cable.
Okay, so it's been around for a while. A gentleman by the name of Ken Holgram, very, very sharp guy, runs that committee. I was on the committee for, I don't remember, 3 years. And they periodically are looking for additional members. And people in this group would be good candidates to be members of that group. They meet about once a month, and they're the ones that act as an interface to Comcast and Verizon and RCN and Lex Media, and try to address on behalf of the town issues that will affect the town. And I presume, although I haven't talked to Ken recently, that as this kind of activity begins to heat up, that Ken and others will be involved in making recommendations to the town about what it does. Anything you want to add to that, George?
The only thing, I was the selectman liaison to that committee, so I had 6 years with it. They were basically telephone technology
Right.
background. And I don't know whether they might need some of the technology that we have in this group.
How are they on computers and network technology? Are they knowledgeable?
Ken certainly is. That's why rather than spend more time on it now, if there's somebody who might be interested in joining the committee, speak to me or George. We can put you into contact with Ken, and they're always looking for technologists to add to the committee.
So George, there's a quick, I think Lexington has a very specific thing. About 20 years ago, I think they bought all the poles, right? From.
No.
No, I thought they did.
Verizon owns the poles.
Actually, George, I don't think Verizon owns all of them. I think they vary. Because I know on my street, I got a couple of different people that own them.
That's correct.
Generally, it's
You're
either people like Verizon or it's people like Eversource.
But a big part of their work previously was on things like poles and cables and repairs and service, and not so much on what we're getting into here.
You mean antenna placement, things like that?
Pardon?
Antenna placement, things like
Yes.
that.
Yeah, yeah, that was not so much part of their work. And then dealing between the three carriers and supporting Lex Media.
Yeah.
So,
Negotiating pole placement.
I wonder how they're going to be dealing with so many more antennas that need to be placed and with so many more carriers. Because potentially, unless somebody legislates about this, this is going to be open to everybody who can provide cell service, everybody who can provide ISP services.
If there's enough interest, I can ask Ken to pop in here and talk about that kind of thing.
We can use an update
Let's keep on
Ken's-
moving.
Ken's a BB&N guy.
Yeah.
That now works for H&H in Lexington, which is their real call is that they run the telephone backroom stuff for information
Okay.
services.
Back-end stuff. Okay, are we ready to move on?
Yep.
Okay, so here we have our traditional towers, which have to handle things like Wi-Fi, GSM, LTE, and 5G in these big towers, and various things about how that's handled. Here's what a 5G NR system will look like. See these different connections? That's more like a mesh network. And this processing is either fog processing or edge processing. At these towers, imagine there's a little edge processing going on. And then you've got the fog computing, which is just outside of these data silos. You've got local processing. And that would probably happen about the same way that your neighborhood cable TV, places where your neighborhood substations work. And then everything that needs to go into the central data silos would do so. But if you want really low latency stuff, it's going to go basically within the coverage of these towers or between several of them. And again, it's like a mesh network, so you don't get the latency, you don't get the gaps in coverage. You go seamlessly from one cell to another, so your Game of Thrones keeps streaming no matter what you're doing, as long as you're outside your home. If you're inside your home, the minute you step outside, your fixed wireless is going to cut out, and you'll have to go over to cell. And there are differences in how you get billed, as everybody knows, in terms of data caps and overages.
Well, that's the same thing happens on your cell phone today. In some cell phones, you can use the wireless in your house to make telephone calls, and then when you go outside your home, you're outside the wireless, it goes onto the public.
My Moto 4G on US Mobile does exactly that.
Yep.
So now, people were asking about the frequencies used, and here are the bands. This is the below 6 gigahertz bands worldwide. In the US, we have a little problem in the below 6 gigahertz. Our military, including the Navy, uses part of this. So we are either going to have to transition the military to other frequencies, other bands, which will take time, or we're going to have some problems that the rest of the world doesn't have. You'll notice there's a single band for Korea. There's a single band for Europe during trials. China has several bands. I would imagine they have other uses for some of the stuff in between. And Japan has a couple of bands. So also in Ireland and Spain, they're mostly using the shorter wavelengths, the higher frequencies. And that could cause problems if there are obstructions. Ireland doesn't have a lot of tall buildings, but when we get to the Chicago test, you'll see what happens. These are the higher frequencies, the ones that do have problems with buildings. And again, in the US, we have a couple of bands where the rest of the world, most of them have single bands. And these are what they look like in the radio spectrum. So now, my document, I'm going to make sure does everybody have some idea of what we're talking about with edge computing, fog computing, and cloud computing? Where the edge processing is nearer to the devices, it has lots of different nodes that do processing. Fog computing is fewer computing units, they are spaced wider apart, there's more distance, you'll have a little more latency, but it's not as bad as sending everything back to the central data silo, which is the cloud. So you have the cloud, you have the fog, and you have the edge of your network. So,
Does ISO specify the frequency bands? Does ISO say that, like band 1 is, here, band 2 is here, band 3 is there, so that the world, whenever somebody says a certain band, everybody in the world knows what frequencies we're talking about?
no, not in the world, but in the USA, it's highly regulated by the FCC.
Yeah, okay, so
Well,
no is the answer, and that's what I was looking for.
That isn't really true. I mean, if you look up something like L-band, which I know is a lower frequency, you'll find
Okay.
lots of different definitions.
Yeah,
Okay, it's just.
But in the United States-
It's all over the place.
yeah, in the United States, where you're permitted to broadcast and where you're not permitted to broadcast is regulated.
Yeah, I'm just talking about the terminology.
Yeah, the
Which is what
terminology is
Peter
different. Yeah, the terminology, there's not a clear standard as to what you call millimeter wave, what you call this and that and the other. But they do fall into definable bands, and the FCC has named some of these bands.
And clearly, things like the military and other high priority communication channels get in the way. And country A decides to use this frequency, country B decides to use this frequency for
Yes.
whatever reason, and you got to work around it.
That is going to be an issue in this country and probably worldwide. So we have done edge, fog, and cloud computing, and let's see, we already have, I think, where to hide these things. So the question also becomes, as the committee is going to have to decide, where are you going to place the antennas? And I've already given this illustration of two different models where there are towers and where there are like light poles. And so now I'm going to briefly get into why you might want to do 5G. So now that we know some of the technical details, what's it good for? The Washington Post has a nice article about this. It's called 5G, What is it good for? And I've got a reference in my notes. I expect to be watching even more high-definition video, as illustrated here, on your smartphone or tablet, including ultra-high-definition movies. I have a little beef with 4K on a cell phone. The human eye and brain cannot resolve 4K on a cell phone or an iPad. We can resolve what is called retina quality, which is approximately 2K HD. It's a little bit more. What 4K does is it allows larger screens, like this size and bigger, to display without seeing all the little pixels, all kinds of nice stuff. But resolution isn't the only factor. Another factor is dynamic range, dynamic color range, dynamic contrast range. HDR, high dynamic range, for both contrast and color. That means your dark scenes will show more detail. And it means you've got this extra signal for yellow between the RGB. And it allows the colors to really pop better. And that's especially true in large screens that tend to wash out and tend to have problems with dark scenes. So anyway, 4K on your cell phone, you're just burning through data. Whereas if you have the fixed wireless, then 5G and 4K HD come into play. So the real excitement over 5G comes with new uses that aren't even possible with today's networks. Many of these involve the revolution in sensors, low-cost transmitters, cloud-based software known as IoT, the Internet of Things, or connected or smart devices. I did a whole presentation on IoT, and I'm not going to go over the whole thing again. I'm just going to tell you that we have today, within our home, a single hub that has many devices connected to it. And it doesn't do a lot of connecting with devices outside of the home. But what we're coming up on is devices outside of the home, including cars and the smart grid for electric power, where your appliances can be cycled if they need to be, and your air conditioning and whatnot. And there are various other ways of using devices outside of the home. And I did a whole presentation on IoT before here, and also one at the Boston Network Users Group, BNUG. And those presentations have been posted, so you can take a look at them if you want a lot of detail about it. So at home, 5G networks will move beyond the cliche of refrigerators that automatically reorder milk to fully integrated living spaces that adjust to the needs of every member of the family, providing home security, optimizing power and water usage, personalizing entertainment. Smart homes will be more energy efficient, supposedly. In an aging population, you'll be able to monitor what seniors are doing and whether they're okay. And you can monitor medication and remind people to take them. And so-called telehealth, where they can do visits with healthcare professionals without having to go all the way out to a doctor's office or someplace like that. And they can track, using the smartwatches, they can track things like the insulin level while you're asleep, things of that nature, which could be very important for some people. So rural users also could benefit, because as you get into this IoT that can go outside of buildings and cover whole communities, you can have applications in smart agriculture, communicating with sensors in the ground, in the crops, weather reports, livestock, machinery, can all be reporting. With weather satellites and drones, these technologies can help farmers know when and how much to water, fertilize, apply pesticides, and they can be more environmentally friendly, and they can conserve our dwindling aquifers. Smart farming may also drive the case for deploying 5G networks in rural areas more generally, which could help bring 5G communications out into the countryside.
So most of those are for connectivity, right? And the real-time aspect of it is sort of overkill when you're watching temperature and so on. So which part of those applications you went over requires sort of a real-time 5G?
If you want to coordinate,
Automobiles.
have you ever been out to a farm the way they do it these days? You have to coordinate a lot of moving parts at one time, and they have to be doing the right things at the right times. And they have to coordinate.
It's not at atomic speeds, it's a much lower speeds. I mean, some of the stuff, like you said, the driving of a car is a little bit different. That's more real time.
I'll give you an example. In my home, I have Ecobee thermostats.
Yeah.
Ecobee thermostats have a base unit and range sensors. When I go into the room, within a matter of seconds, it senses that I'm in the room and it activates the thermostat for that room. When I leave the room, it senses that I'm no longer there and it deactivates the thermostat so that it's no longer required to heat or cool that room.
Right, but the response time on that is seconds, not microseconds or...
Right, I'm saying seconds because I don't know the latency off the top of my
Yeah,
head.
I'm just saying,
But
most
it's-
domains, you don't need that kind of...
I don't need nanosecond response
Yep.
for
Yep.
heating or cooling.
Yep.
Latency tends to be milliseconds when you're dealing with cars and trucks on a highway.
Yeah.
You don't really want to be any longer than that.
So most of the other applications we're talking about are on cars, so it's mostly connectivity.
Yeah,
Enhanced connectivity to
but
the
there's also
devices.
things out in rural areas like distribution centers and trucking terminals. Those tend to be outside of 495, places around here. And you have warehouses and you have these deliveries that'll be by drones. And you don't want them colliding, you want the air traffic to be controlled nicely. And so there's a lot of things that can come in the future.
I think the
And
real issue,
highways go out into the rural countryside.
but I think the real issue is that in your home, all you have to do is have your home set up, and it doesn't matter whether my home is set up in order for you to work. Whereas with an automobile, if I'm driving down the road, in order to avoid a collision, the system has to be able to see the details of my car and of the highway and of the street lamps and where the pedestrians are and all the other cars.
More importantly, John, if you're in an urban area and there's autonomous driving, you have to know that the car around the corner that you can't see and can't sense is about to run the red light because it's going 80 miles an hour down an urban street,
Right.
and it's not going to stop.
So my only point there is that even if 5G is out there in hypothetically 10 years, it could be 30 years before all the old cars are off the road and all the new cars have the automation built in that allow you to do this.
And it's classic urban rural too, because you look around an urban area, you find predominantly, I'm gonna generalize here, newer cars
Yeah.
in urban areas, urbanized areas, and older cars in many rural areas.
And the Amish are gonna have to put this on carriages.
Well, it's gonna be injectable for horses.
Anyway,
And one of the things, you've been talking about all the wonderful things this is going to be doing for sensing, the wonderful things it's going to be doing for sensing
Yeah.
and the home and tracking this and tracking that. Politically, that is to say that the possibility of governmental control or snooping of various sorts is huge. If that, when you give that, you're going to get into that, I guess, on the political side.
it is
but-
no accident,
No, we'll pay for it with
China-
Facebook currency, we're good.
it is no accident that China is the world leader right now in rolling out 5G cell phone service. They are doing exactly as you say. They are issuing social points and demerits based on your social media activities, and they have you check in with your local committee on your cell phone and at home using whatever their equivalent of Alexa is. And in some rural areas, some areas where they've got cultural differences, they're trying to assimilate and force assimilate whole populations using exactly this kind of technology.
Not that there's anything wrong with it.
It may be a good thing, it may be a bad thing. After all, our administration is having its troubles integrating diverse populations too. And their solution so far isn't working out so well and isn't going down so well with the public.
There's one thing that came in on this old house this week.
Yes.
It's always a problem, like your washing machine hose or your water tank goes.
Yeah, yeah.
They do now have control valves that are run via the Bluetooth, whatever they call it.
Bluetooth, okay,
Internet, however.
okay.
But God forbid something happens while you're away, it'll
Yeah.
shut the water off.
And it will notify you.
It will notify you, right?
So
And it's almost perfect, because you don't want to be in a shower and somebody turns the water on at the same time you're in the shower, it shuts everything off.
Yeah, true. These
almost-
are also, this is the remote sensing kind of thing, and
Yeah.
the instantaneous response, and then it has to respond to maybe it calls the repair person for you,
Right.
so that if it's an emergency. Let's see how this is working in the real world. It's all cell service right now. The fixed wireless has not yet been rolled out, although there are some discussions about this. Let's see Chicago. Here they were using a cell phone, which is 5G enabled. There are not a lot of cell phones yet on the market that have 5G chipsets in them. However, they do exist. And what I'm trying to scroll down to is which ones they are. Qualcomm has been making chips for 5G phones. And Huawei has been doing that, but they are not going to be allowed in this country, quite possibly. And so what's being used in the Chicago testing, if I can find it, well, anyway, there is a phone that's tied to the Verizon network, and it is Verizon which is doing it. And so what they've got is, there is something interesting that happens through beamforming, and I'm going to give an illustration of what beamforming is. Get that as big as I can. Traditional 4G and anything that doesn't use beamforming is broadcasting. It's always going to be high on a tower or a building, and it's going to cover a broad area, but you have limitations on how many devices can connect. The signal isn't going to be crystal clear everywhere. If there's any obstruction, you're going to have to move to a different cell. These tend to use macro cells down to the picocell level. With beamforming, you can have more direct contact and more specific areas that get better coverage. That's very important when you have a lot of data passing. So that. The other thing beamforming does is it produces interesting effects on distance versus signal strength. You normally would expect that if you're this close to an antenna, you'd be at the top of your curve, and then it would tail off. And we'll see that in Dallas, that's more the case. But in Chicago, where they're using more street-level types of things, the antennas are no more than 20 feet off the ground. So they're formed in such a way that if you're too close to the antenna, you don't get as good performance. It's best if you're a certain number of feet, like 200 to 400 feet. And then it may rise or it may stay the same out to the edge of the cell, which is 500 to 600 feet. And then you'll notice these curves end because you'll get an abrupt cutoff. At the moment, it isn't really a 675-foot radius. It's 675 feet line of sight. These signals cannot bounce off buildings yet. But Qualcomm says they have technology that can make them do that. So you can get around corners. But in practice, PCMag was getting, this year, 300 to 350 feet of distance from cell sites 1 month, and then it got up to 500 to 675 feet depending on site. But at the moment, you can't have visual obstacles. Glass will block the signal almost entirely. Concrete completely blocks the signal. And trees will, if you have 2 or 3 trees, you're not going to get much 5G signal. So 5G might take off faster in low-lying cities like Dallas, Houston, and Kansas City than in Chicago, New York, or Boston because of the line-of-sight requirement. In other words, whereas these low-lying cities are doing pretty well in 2020, we might be 2022 to 2024 in cities like Boston because of the topography, because of the trees. Okay, so I move a little
Can I ask you a dumb question?
Yeah.
Is it, why not having, redundancy, and you can reduce one against the other? Telephone, if you want to call somebody and talk to them, fine, okay, the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
If you want the other stuff on there, have a different parallel channel to it. Is that possible to do 2 streams in 1 beam?
Yes, that's called MIMO, and it is done. It's used multiple antennas, multiple data streams. It's done more with routers inside your house now, but you could just as easily do that outdoors and use several locations in order to augment the signal. But it shouldn't be necessary with outdoors because the signal is strong enough and there is enough bandwidth.
Well, the only reason why, we all use cell phones, and I use cell phone in emergency at Island. You'd think you'd get good, it took 3 guys to find a phone that would work. And I was in the middle of nowhere then.
Okay.
So what the hell good is a telephone if you can't use it?
Right. With 5G, if you can't get the 5G signal, you can drop back to 4G.
Okay.
And so there are many more towers. But as it gets built out, the idea is there will be so many of these utility pole types of antennas. There will be so many. There will be so many and so closely spaced that you will be able to get a signal. So, so that's what has happened in Chicago. That when you step, the example is a Starbucks that has a glass door. If the author was outside of Starbucks, they got 641 megabits per second. But the moment they stepped inside Starbucks behind the window, just a few feet, they were getting 258 megabits per second, about half, a loss of 60%. And that's better than they were seeing previously, which was a loss of over 64%. Stone buildings are even worse. The effect of trees. There was a block of, there was a street that had trees, and they were at a 500-foot distance from the cell site. The signal could drop out completely by putting 3 lightly leaved trees between the people testing and the cell site. That was at near the edge of the coverage. Step a little to the left or to the right, 1.1 gigabit per second. So that's a big difference.
So then your coverage will be much worse in the summer.
It could be, depending on whether or not they're able to make the signal bounce off of buildings, whether they're able to get redundancy between adjacent cells, a little overlap here and there. It depends, or they may even be able to patch in with a little Wi-Fi here and a little this and that.
This is the perfect technology for the Sahara.
Yes. It would be, except that satellite is cheaper there. But anyway, this is the reason why you get all these effects is because of beamforming. And Qualcomm and Ericsson, Ericsson, by the way, provides Verizon's infrastructure in Chicago. Qualcomm and Ericsson have a paper about bouncing the signal off buildings, but they need frequencies that are currently not available to them. Trees have less of an effect in a flat city like Dallas, where the signal was being transmitted from up on a building. So what I want to show is what they were doing in Dallas. There they used a
Just for the
hotspot.
record, Bob, beamforming is not new. It's been available in your own router for a long time.
Yeah, beamforming has been around ever since the early days of radar, as a matter of
That's
fact.
right. Before you had
Well-
any radars, exactly, for missile tracking.
Well, yeah, but beamforming has been made much more practical as a result of different kinds of antennas.
Yes,
It may have been available with large antennas, but now you have basically a whole bunch of antennas on a screen or a panel or
Right.
something like that, and it's formed by the interference of the beams from each one of them.
right, there's constructive and destructive interference.
Right,
And so you get hot and cold spots.
right.
But I should have brought along an illustration of a MIMO router with all its antennas.
Yeah.
A forest of antennas for the AG and AH standards. Not just the 2 to 4 that you have with the current, whatever it is. It's not G, it's A something. But in Dallas, they were using a different type of transmitter. They were using the Netgear AT&T Nighthawk 5G hotspot. So this is a cellular hotspot, still not fixed wireless. And the interesting thing there was where the antenna was. The 5G antenna, these are 4G antennas, and look at their size. And then the smaller one is a 5G panel. The antennas themselves are even smaller than that. But the panel is so much smaller that you can put them in places where you wouldn't want to put a 4G cell tower. So this was on top of a building, which gave a very different kind of a curve. If you were closer to the signal, to the source, you got this traditional down as you get farther away. Then there must be something that happens in the middle where you get a sweet spot, and then as you get toward the edge of the coverage, you get nothing. And there were some spots where in this midsection you couldn't get any coverage. So there might have been a building in the way, who knows. Again, this stuff right now cannot go around corners. So that is closing in on the end of the illustrations that I am doing. I'm going to talk a little bit about fixed wireless, even though we don't know exactly what's going to happen. But one thing about the cellular, 5G is still downloads only. So what about home internet? Mobile 5G versus fixed 5G. And there is an article about this. And I am at this point going to start showing you what I've got in my document because it shows up nicely, just like a slide. Okay, if I can get it to go in there correctly.
You haven't mentioned anything about time, years.
Yeah, there has been some mention of when it's going to happen, and I have an article that I can use. I want to bring my documents so that you can see it. There. Okay. Before we get into the timeline of the rollout, let's do something about, can I scroll? Just a minute. I know how to handle this. I just click in here and we're going to be fine. 5G mobile works when you leave your house. It could provide 5G internet to other devices on the go, like that hotspot and there's no hardware installation to do. Fixed wireless, oops, too far. Fixed wireless 5G, FWA, allows all your devices to get 5G, including computers. It provides a reliable connection, and it's more likely you'll have unlimited usage. In other words, no data caps, though it may be more expensive. The actual price you pay per month would be more, but overages on cell plans can be horrific. So, mobile 5G pros and cons, advantages. You can access the mobile network's entire coverage area. There's easy setup, just buy the device and connect it to a provider that has 5G. Disadvantages. It's easy to get charged overage fees for too much data usage. You could experience poor coverage in some areas. And fixed wireless, advantages. Fast 5G-based Wi-Fi access throughout your house. That's done using traditional Wi-Fi. The 5G signal won't penetrate. A dedicated signal from a nearby 5G cell, that is 5G, that is millimeter. Disadvantages, the signal is lost the minute you leave, although you could have a cell plan that allows you to continue. Special hardware is required in terms of having a modem and a router.
What's the difference between FWA 5G and 802.11, I think it's AC, which is 1 gigabit?
Okay, AC is a router spec.
Sure.
This is a modem spec.
Oh, what, please?
Modem. So the modem and the router are being treated differently for the
All
purpose
right,
of this
I
discussion.
have 1 gig RCN to my house right now.
Okay,
My wireless my router can handle that.
yeah,
But just because of it's wireless, you never get 1 gig. But I continually get 600 and 700.
this has been the experience that has happened with cellular. It should
That's
happen.
wireless, you know.
Yeah.
If I were wired, I get 1 gig.
Well, you can do Ethernet wiring with this. It doesn't matter. From the modem, it could be Ethernet.
But my point is, you know, what's the difference between what I now have and what you're talking about with 5G? In this particular scenario that I'm talking about.
Theoretically, in home internet, you could get much faster speeds, better throughput. You could have more simultaneous devices because you're going to use massive MIMO, which is a new type of router. And the main thing is the backhaul back to your provider theoretically has more bandwidth, a lot more.
But unless we're playing interactive video games or interactive movies or something, is there anything that we really do in the house that needs any of this?
Say you've got Internet of Things devices. The more and more you get of those, the more bandwidth you need, but they're
But
relatively...
most of those, I think it goes back to what somebody said earlier, that, you know, if my refrigerator talks to things every couple of minutes or
Okay.
whatever, I don't need gigabit performance on my refrigerator or
That's
air
right. The
conditioner.
refrigerator doesn't have to say you need milk in a nanosecond.
Right.
But if you have a car,
That's
Well,
different.
that's
that's
I-
gonna be at your house.
No, I understand that if I'm driving on a road and I don't want to hit another car, that this stuff starts becoming important. I have no question about that.
Okay,
But
let's
what
say-
I don't understand, though,
Okay.
and this goes back to the Hiawatha Bray article that some of us read
Yeah.
a week or, but I think it was just a week ago, that for most of what we do, I don't see this as being very important for a while.
Yeah,
Yeah, you can switch, you could program the systems to switch between devices and step around at a speed that would be faster than anybody would really need to use it with current technology.
Suppose that you're doing a 4K HD stream, and there's other people in your household doing the same. And now you're moving between different points in your house.
I'm not saying that you couldn't
Possibly even
construct
moving
a
between different
scenario,
devices.
but
Typically.
It
But-
might
Wait for
work.
Ray said, you're waiting for the right app to generate the demand.
Right.
It could be.
There is no
that's right. It's
advantage.
the term used to be killer app. What's the killer app
Yeah.
for 5G?
Yeah.
And I think the answer is cars.
Or maybe in-home, you have some kind of a servant robot.
Okay, okay.
And that's probably coming after cars. So, but the scenario where 5G makes sense in your home is in your castle, if you have 6 or 8 video rooms, and they're all on a high, you know, a 4K screen.
Well, that's what he's started to try to say, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
and everybody's watching something different.
Yeah.
You want to be able to see it smooth.
Running from room to room.
That's the only good reason. yeah.
And I was going to
You know,
say,
those people need 5G today.
I was going to say at the very end that, yeah, not many people need it for anything today. It's something that's being built out for the future, and when you see, you know, when you think about the timescales and you think about the problems that are happening now with the rollout, it might be here just in time for the killer app that does arrive.
And then maybe the gamers who've been the reason for the previous upgrades of
Yes.
speed are going to be the ones that want it.
John, can I
Yes.
just say one thing? I think that this kind of, it's interesting to hear this kind of discussion, because I think this discussion occurred on 4G. People said, well, there's no need for it. And I was reading that the U.S. led the world in 4G's development and rollout. In 2016, 4G added $100 million to Americans' GDP. It flooded American tech companies with revenues. From 2011 to 2014, industry jobs increased by 84%. That was just...
Industry jobs of what?
Yeah, technology refresh is going to cause a lot of things to get obsolete, and then people have to pay money.
Yeah.
But as an engineer, there's no compelling reason for most things until we get the killer app.
That's right.
And since you can't buy Huawei components, it doesn't make any difference. Ericsson has to get up to speed.
Well, I'm going to
Intel's
get
not
into
involved
what
in that.
manufacturers are doing what very shortly.
Yeah. I'm trying to help you here, Bob.
Fixed wireless, yeah, okay. Fixed wireless has the benefit of reliability over 5G cellular or mobile.
In fact, there might be even pent-up demand where people are waiting for it before they buy, so they're buying less today than they would have if they weren't. My wife's waiting for 5G.
God bless her.
Maybe.
I hope she enjoys it.
I remember how excited I was when we went to 56 KB.
And then, of course,
we had patience.
yeah,
I was excited when the modems got faster.
okay, yeah, the modems are going to get fixed.
So once you took your telephone and you stuck it down in the
Yeah.
little thing.
John, you're talking about KB. I was thinking, boy.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, anyway, so another thing that made,
I wonder if there's an app for low latency video, not conferencing, but video conversations, right? Video calls.
take a look.
Because right now, once a week, I do a Google Hangout with one of our band members who's in Ottawa.
Yeah,
He can hear us,
Yeah.
but he can't play with us because of the latency. If
Yeah.
we could reduce that latency, he could actually play along with us as if he were in the room.
have you seen the ads for the Facebook portal device?
No.
That
Yeah.
it's big enough so that it shows full body,
Okay,
so that you can see all the things going on in the room.
right.
Very useful for musicians who are trying to practice with each other.
Okay.
And trying to develop new music. And the
Today's
latency.
latency, though,
Yeah.
makes it very difficult. But if you could reduce that round trip time,
Yeah.
we could probably play together.
Yeah, but there would be other ways of solving that if people wanted to.
Yes.
For example, your signal could be delayed by that latency time, so that you guys would all
Oh,
work
yeah,
together,
no,
right?
he can play with us when the signal arrives in Ottawa.
What I'm saying.
We can't hear him because the round trip would take too long.
Time delay works when it's like mostly one way, like if you've got a satellite report on the news,
Right,
they use time delay.
right,
And radio uses time delay for rules compliance.
right.
But if you're doing it two-way in real time, you're going to want to reduce that latency.
Baseball is using time delay of the video into the dugout so you can't pick up the signs.
Right, that's to
Right,
prevent cheating. But,
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah, if you have
Yeah.
real-time, if you have real-time 5G inside a stadium, everybody in that stadium can be watching everything that's going on. But then again, so could the players in the dugout or anything.
Well, I think Skype has near real time. I think there's a version of Skype that, that maybe is a premium version of stuff, because I've seen sometimes on the news and stuff when they have people reporting from distance on Skype, sometimes it's almost an instantaneous communication, and sometimes there's a definite lag. So depending upon the connection, there's the ability to get near instantaneous communication over long distances. But you're right, something that's critical, like music, where the beat is the beat, and you're either there or you're not. That's a whole nother issue.
Okay, so 5G fixed wireless versus the mobile wireless. There's more in my notes about this, but I think we might want to start moving on to what's going on, where and when can you get it. AT&T is rolling out 5G fixed wireless, and they've got a business plan that gets 50 megabits per second currently with AT&T wireless broadband, and they're going to lay the groundwork on top of that kind of performance till they get 5G. They are starting by using an LTE technology, which is transitional, and then they're saying within 3 to 5 years, probably about 4 years from now, 5G would serve as a broadband replacement product. So the fixed wireless is 2022, 2024, something like that, depending on what happens politically and in regulatory terms. Pricing has not been announced, nor has information about data caps and overage charges, but probably the fixed wireless won't have the caps initially. Devices aren't cheap. Netgear Nighthawk Hotspot costs $500. 5G cell phones from Samsung and Huawei, let's say Samsung because you can get it in this country, $1,300.
Well, that'll stop the rollout.
Well, iPhones today are $1,100.
Yeah.
And the 5G iPhone has been delayed for reasons I'll talk about, and it'll be in the $1,300 to $1,500 price range too. But it will not require a separated hotspot the way they were planning on doing. There was a big story a while back about motherboards that were manufactured in a Chinese factory, and it went to Apple and Amazon Web Services and others, some of whom deal with the US government. Motherboards these days are multi-layer. They've got a top layer, a middle layer, and a bottom layer. In that middle layer, someone inserted, allegedly, a chip less than the size of a grain of rice. And it started transmitting after these things were switched on. They think it was a spy chip from China. Shortly after saying it happened, Apple reversed themselves and said it never happened. And the US government said it never happened. NSA said it didn't happen. But Apple stopped using that factory. This changed the equation of how they were going to roll out 5G technology. First, they partnered with Intel for 5G modems, which would have worked with the iPhone. Intel could not produce the chips fast enough. And Intel has now pulled out of the consumer market. So, now, I'm going to open the next link, and now there was a question.
No, I mean, this is the Supermicro story, right?
Supermicro.
And like you said, everybody's disavowed knowledge. and Bloomberg, it was good sources within Bloomberg, but it hasn't been corroborated anyplace else.
Yes, the sources were good, and it appears that it might have happened.
The new thriller by Jeff Deaver has hypothesizes goggles used by the gaming community that they would be handing out free of charge to people in the military or at a discount, and everything the goggle sees would be recorded in the cloud and sent off to the Chinese.
That's what's happening right now with drones. Almost all the drones are Chinese manufactured, and a lot of the routing goes through China and back. So they're mapping the whole country and they're watching it real time.
Yeah, IoT devices, again, they may have to rethink what they're doing, the companies that want to sell in America, because of this Chinese problem. Apple, first they had Intel, as you're seeing in this headline, and then Intel pulls out. And then all of a sudden, a lawsuit that was long-standing, a bitter rivalry between Apple and Qualcomm, all of a sudden, they settled. And Apple is going to be using Qualcomm's 5G chips. This has delayed the new iPhone by 1 to 2 years. These kinds of delays are going to happen throughout the tech industry because of something that the current administration in Washington has decided. They've decided, based on the alleged spy chip incident and the arrest of a Huawei official in Canada, that Huawei and maybe the Chinese in general are not a good place to do business and share technology. This means that US companies are not sharing what they know, and they're telling their employees not to talk even about standards with Chinese colleagues. And the result is the international standards either are going to be slow to roll out, or they may not even have an international standard. This could lead to some serious issues. And in Europe, there is some stuff going on along similar lines. Huawei was providing the backbone stuff. They were providing the hardware, the chips for the 5G infrastructure in Europe. And now European companies are afraid to use Huawei because their products might get banned in the US. And this would include phones, which are made by Nokia and Ericsson. And they want to be able to compete in the US, and they want to have their network be able to talk to our network across the Atlantic. So the US is pushing for a ban on Huawei in Europe. And still, Huawei's prices are so much lower. And they've already got some investment in Huawei. It's a good question of how that's going to shake out. And getting pretty close to the end of what I want to cover here. In the US, there could be a slowdown, as I say, in global rollout of 5G, especially the fixed wireless, because of this issue. I think the next headline, and these are all in my notes, which will be posted. Again, Intel exited the 5G modem business, and this was close to the time that Apple and Qualcomm settled their lawsuit. So we know pretty much what Apple is likely to do. I don't know why we have something frozen here, but let me see if I can close my browser.
Rural internet providers have a lot of Huawei hardware, and the question, and it's legacy, it's installed, who's going to pay for ripping it out?
Yeah, now I'm going to have to restart because I know something froze up in here, and I think it was my web browser that did it.
It's a pain in the ass when that happens.
Bob, is this a good time to pause since we have 10 minutes left anyway?
It is definitely a good time to get back into questions and answers. And there's just one more or two more things I wanted to get at with the political end. We can discuss questions and answers.
Well, Bob, while you're doing that, I can build on Huawei. This is from Fareed Zakaria, GPS on Sunday in March of this year, where he did a report on 5G. And he said Huawei is becoming expert at 5G. This is not his report, but a report actually from the Department of Defense report. Huawei is becoming expert at 5G networks, which make it one of the world's leaders in that technology. Today, already, China has nearly 10 times as many 5G base stations as the United States, and it plans to launch the first widespread 5G commercial network by 2020. And China has already assigned airwaves for 5G at mid-level frequency to its 3 state telecom companies. This mid-range frequency is at the sweet spot of range and speed, requiring fewer base stations and enabling a faster, cheaper rollout of 5G.
That mid-range, that mid-band, that's where the U.S. military has some of that bandwidth.
That's the next paragraph, because it said, so if middle frequency spectrum would translate to a quicker rollout of 5G in the U.S., why isn't Trump announcing its auction? Because much of it is already used by the Pentagon. And while possible, it's a bureaucratic headache to get the government and the commercial sector to share spectrum. 5G represents a huge economic opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I brought up earlier about the,
Paul, do you know why Apple selected Qualcomm and not Intel?
Intel was initially selected. Then Intel was not delivering. And they could not deliver. Apple and Intel broke off their relationship. And that was the point at which Apple settled their lawsuit with Qualcomm, just ahead of Intel dropping out of the industry. The other thing that I wanted to get at was the merger between Sprint and T-Mobile, because Sprint has been using the lower bandwidth. T-Mobile has been concentrating on the higher millimeter wave bandwidth. This merger, while it could benefit those companies, it could also restrict competition and run into all kinds of regulatory issues. Again, possibly slowing the rollout for both companies. And that's pretty much as far as I wanted to get today, except to give my take on it, which eventually I can give if people, after people finish with what you want to ask. Go ahead.
So under the, when you talk about the so-called grain of rice thing on the chipboard, under the heading of paranoia, I think most of us remember the RSA issue a number of years ago, where the NSA and the RSA sort of had a joint development project, if you will.
Yeah?
There's nothing to say, because I'm paranoid to a certain extent, there's nothing to say that U.S. manufacturers aren't working with the NSA today to do the grain of rice in American-made products or in things made by Ericsson and other manufacturers.
I think they would not have to do anything special because the technology as it exists today could very easily accommodate exactly what you say. The ability already exists.
There's another little thing that people tend to forget about. When we were building things at Raytheon, everybody who worked at Raytheon had to have a military clearance. And that didn't mean you couldn't have spies, but you did have to have a clearance. Over the course of the 90s and then into the current century, we were buying more and more products from Microsoft and IBM and all sorts of other companies that you might think are American companies. And they are American companies, but they manufacture a lot of their product, both hardware and software, outside of the United States.
Right.
And Microsoft doesn't have any regulation that all their programmers have to be American citizens with US clearances. So Lord only knows how many Chinese spies, if they want them, have jobs with IBM and Microsoft and all these other companies and putting stuff, entrances into the software and other
That's why you shouldn't use Microsoft Office. You should use open source.
Oh yeah, that makes me feel a lot better.
You don't want the Chinese reading.
Then anybody could get in.
You don't want the Chinese reading the letter to your girlfriend.
Well, the thing about open source, if I may, because I know that John and I have differing views about open source, it also has more eyes on it so that if anything funny does happen, somebody's going to find it. And with LibreOffice and with this free and libre open source software, not the open source Microsoft is putting out, not the open source that some other companies are putting out, Google, but actual open source. You've got a community that looks at it. And theoretically, more eyes means if anybody tries any funny business, somebody's going to call them out.
Which is one of the reasons why Linux is so successful, is that it's fairly secure because there's a gazillion people looking at the kernel in Linux and making sure that it's doing what it's doing.
And looking at all the software.
There's also a flavor of Unix, SE Linux, that's designed for security that adds beyond.
I'm sure there are
Oh, yeah.
flavors
Yeah.
of all this stuff that wraps.
There are
wraps.
variants on all
But
of these.
the advantage to open source is that in general, it is secure just by virtue of the size. There's a number of eyes that are looking at it. It's harder to inject something that's malicious into it.
There's also, if we wanted to get technical, there's also permissions that are way different in Linux from the way Windows was. Windows was designed with convenience in mind, not security. Whereas Linux, from the very beginning, was designed not to allow people to run as root, which is an administrator.
Did you say earlier that there was a potential issue with exposure to radiation from the towers?
There are people who are concerned with exposure to radiation. These towers put
I
out
thought
one-
that was debunked about 15 years ago.
Yeah, but the thing is, you've still got people
Well,
believing
yeah.
it.
That's right.
On
That's
cable
exactly
TV,
right.
you still see them on our local saying,
Yeah.
you know, you gotta get rid of all the radiation in your house.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're bathed in radiation. I
Right.
mean, ever since the
Well, if you have accidents, you get the
days
radio.
of radio.
Right.
And, I mean, this doesn't prove, what I'm gonna say doesn't prove anything.
Yeah.
But this has been a moving target, because people just say radiation, or
Yeah.
AC, or RF.
Yeah.
Different frequencies do different things,
Right.
okay? You don't really wanna open up your microwave, or, you know, let your microwave oven broadcast,
Yeah.
because that particular wavelength or frequency will activate water molecules. That's how it works.
Yeah.
And it can burn you.
And a
All
lot
right?
of
Fry your eyeballs.
But if you get off that frequency, then it's perfectly all
We're
right.
gonna come up with new water molecules that no longer have 105 degree
Right.
bend in the atom.
But
You could make the H2O on a straight line, so you wouldn't have that problem.
No, it's still the opposite.
Before we end-
It's still the H, still the
Everybody will have
H.
drinking water, it'll solve everything.
Still the
Now,
H.
we're getting near the end of our time, and before we end, just one last thing about the health effects. That depends on the power and the distance you are.
Yeah.
The inverse square law.
And exposure time.
And time.
Yes.
And the thing is, these signals are 4 times weaker at least than current cell towers. And you will be at a distance that is going to be long enough so that your exposure will actually be less.
Right.
Until they get a higher density.
But as I say, those quantitative things don't really apply, because the effects that you worry about are frequency dependent.
Yeah.
Okay, so different frequencies might, that's the important thing,
Yeah.
might cause different sensitivity. On the other hand, the scares have always been posed a moving target. Okay, it was 60 cycles at one point, 60 hertz, the power line, and then it was something else. And every time it has been, these things have been studied in specific instances, they haven't worked out. I mean, there was the radar on the Cape, for example. Okay, and I knew some of the guys who investigated that, and it turned out not to be of any importance.
My cousin claims that he gets headaches from windmills.
That might be from sound vibrations.
Yeah,
That can
You got
happen
people
from
bring all
sound
the RF
vibrations.
meters that they pay good money for and try to get rid of all the intrusions into their house.
Yeah, but the thing about windmills is they make sound that most people don't hear, but some people are sensitive to it.
It's a low frequency vibration with a.
And there's also a very high frequency vibration that exists
Is there?
with windmills.
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
And with fluorescent lights. I can sometimes hear fluorescent lights.
Well, that's one of
A
the
lot of people
reasons.
don't.
Well, and that's one of the reasons that our fluorescent lights, or why we operate here on 60 hertz
Yeah.
in the US. It's 50 hertz in Europe, and people
It's
can
cheaper.
complain about flicker because the eyes can pick it up.
Wow.
They're putting chips in the fluorescent lights to pick up sound in the rooms so they can hear everything you're saying.
Can be
Can you
done.
speak up?
Yeah, right.
No, Alexa listens to all that.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right,
That was
thank you.
excellent.